You saw me when no one else would.
The sun hung low above the mountains, casting long orange shadows across the small frontier town that clung to the edge of the desert. Dust drifted in slow swirls along the main street, stirred by wagon wheels and the shuffle of boots. It was market day, and the square pulsed with life, ranchers bargaining over cattle feed, women haggling for flour, children darting between stalls, their laughter rising like sparks into the hot air. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang out, mingling with the braying of donkeys and the chatter of neighbors exchanging rumors. But beneath the bustle there lingered something harder, sharper. The town's heartbeat carried a note of cruelty, the kind that thrives when the weak are cornered and the crowd grows hungry for spectacle. At the center of the square stood the market post, its weathered wood cracked by years of wind and sun. Bound there with fraying rope was a girl scarcely into womanhood. Her name was Sarah, though few bothered to use it. Today she was no more than a public mark of shame, the daughter of the town drunkard who staggered through saloons and left debts behind him like broken bottles in the street. A crudely painted sign swung from her neck, the words scrawled in thick strokes, "Drunkard's Daughter." Her dress was torn at the hem, her cheeks streaked with dirt where tears had already carved their paths. She kept her head bowed, dark hair falling forward like a curtain, but it did little to shield her from the stares. A cluster of men near the butcher's stall chuckled, their voices thick with derision. "Apple don't fall far from the tree," one said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Women passed by in stiff skirts, whispering behind gloved hands, their eyes narrowing with judgment. Children pointed, giggling, repeating the words from the sign as though it were a nursery rhyme. Some townsfolk turned away, unwilling to join but unwilling to interfere. To them she was simply the price of gossip and entertainment, another soul ground down beneath the town's relentless need to punish weakness. "Her ma's been dead near a decade," one merchant murmured to another, "and her pa drinks himself blind most nights. Best she learn shame early. It'll save her from worse." The words floated across the square, and Sarah felt them burn as if branded on her skin. She tried to steady her breath, tried to will herself into stone, but humiliation pressed down on her until it was hard to stand. She thought of her father passed out in some saloon corner, oblivious to her torment, and for the first time wished she had never carried his name. The laughter grew sharper, like knives scraping against bone. From the far end of the street, a man approached with the quiet gait of one used to silence. He walked beside his horse, not riding, dust clinging to the cuffs of his trousers. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that had seen too much sun and too much sorrow. His frame was lean, almost gaunt, the posture of someone who had carried burdens for years. There was no rifle slung across his shoulder, no gleaming pistol strapped to his hip, only the plainness of a weary rancher whose presence did not immediately command attention. His name was Eli, though no one here knew it. To the crowd, he was another stranger passing through, a man who had the look of wandering carved into him. A few glanced his way, then dismissed him. The town had no shortage of drifters and broken men, and this one seemed no different. Yet his eyes, beneath the brim of his hat, lingered on the scene unfolding at the post. Eli slowed, taking in the jeers, the sign, the girl with her shoulders drawn tight as if bracing for stones that might follow words. Something old stirred in him, an ache buried so deep he had thought it gone. Loneliness clung to him like dust, but even through the wear of years he felt the sharp injustice of what he saw. He had known humiliation once, and it had nearly broken him. He stopped at the edge of the square. The crowd was thick, voices rising, a spectacle in full swing. No one noticed the way his hand slipped into his worn satchel, fingers brushing against the wrapped loaf he had bought that morning on the road from a peddler's cart. It was nothing special, bread baked coarse, hardened by travel, but to a man who lived alone, it was sustenance enough. Now, standing before the cruelty of the scene, it became something more. He stepped forward, boots crunching softly on the grit. He cut through the circle of onlookers. Laughter faltered as people realized someone was moving toward the girl, not away. Eli's presence was quiet, but there was something in his stride, steady, unhurried, that drew silence in its wake. Sarah lifted her head, startled, as he came to stand before her. For a long moment, he said nothing. He studied her face, saw the fear and the humiliation, and beneath it the fragile defiance of someone who had not yet surrendered to despair. Then he reached into his satchel and drew out the loaf of bread. The gesture was simple, almost absurdly so. He held it out to her as though nothing separated them, as though she were not bound and shamed. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, rope scraping her wrists as she reached. The bread was warm against her skin, heavier than it should have been. Her eyes lifted, meeting his, and something passed between them, a recognition that neither cruelty nor shame could extinguish the quiet dignity still alive within her. Around them, the crowd shifted. The butcher stopped laughing. The gossiping women fell silent, their whispers cut short. What had been mockery now teetered on unease, as if this simple act of kindness had exposed their cruelty for what it was. A few scoffed to cover their discomfort. "A fool's pity," one muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah clutched the bread to her chest, tears stinging anew, though these were different, softer, edged with relief. The stranger's eyes, dark and tired, held hers as if anchoring her against the weight of the crowd. For the first time that day, she felt seen not as a mark of shame but as a person worth saving. Eli did not speak. Words were fragile things, easily broken, but gestures, those lived longer. He nodded once, faint and almost imperceptible, before stepping back. The square, once roaring with laughter, seemed to hold its breath. Dust swirled between them, golden in the late sun, and the bond forged in that silence was more unshakable than any rope. The moment lingered, unspoken but undeniable. A lonely rancher had given bread to a shamed girl, and in doing so had shifted the balance of the town's cruelty. The story had begun, though none yet realized it. For now, there was only a girl clutching her bread as if it were hope itself, and a stranger whose quiet compassion had turned an afternoon of mockery into the beginning of something the frontier would not forget. Word spread on the wind like wildfire through dry grass. The Ramirez gang was riding again. By noon the whispers had reached every corner of the town, from the blacksmith's forge to the schoolhouse where children pressed their faces to the windows, sensing unease in the adults around them. Merchants muttered over their goods, ranchers clenched their jaws, and mothers gathered children closer to their skirts. These were not the kind of outlaws who blustered and then vanished. Ramirez and his men were wolves with human faces, and every rancher in the canyons beyond could point to smoldering ruins as proof. They had taken cattle, coin, and lives without hesitation. Sheriff Dalton had once sworn he'd drive them out, had puffed his chest and promised justice, but promises meant little when faced with men who rode without fear of God or law. The town carried that knowledge heavy in its chest now, waiting for hoofbeats on the horizon. Sarah drifted beyond the edge of town, rope burns fresh on her wrists, the crude sign gone but not forgotten. She clutched the loaf of bread as if it were the only tether keeping her from unraveling completely. Her steps carried her toward the dry creek bed, where cracked earth stretched like scars across the land. She sat on a boulder, shoulders hunched, trying to steady the storm inside her. Shame still clung to her skin, the sound of laughter and jeers echoing in her memory, and though her hands pressed the bread to her chest, she could not escape the hollow ache in her heart. She didn't hear Eli approach until his shadow fell across her. He stood a few paces away, hat pulled low, the same quiet presence as before. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence broken only by the distant rattle of cicadas. Finally, he knelt beside the creek, scooping up dry dust in his palm, letting it slip through his fingers. "This land remembers every wound," he said softly, his voice roughened by years and solitude. "But it don't hold on to blame. That's men's doing, and they've laid it on your shoulders when it was never yours to carry." Her eyes widened at his words. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such calm certainty. "They'll never let me forget," she whispered. "Maybe not," Eli answered, meeting her gaze, his eyes steady as stone. "But you don't have to believe them. What's carved on a sign don't make the truth of who you are." His tone was so gentle it startled her, as if the weight of his words alone could shift the shame that had pinned her down. For the first time, Sarah felt the smallest ember of hope stir within her. She nodded, unable to find words, and when Eli rose to leave, she watched him as though memorizing the shape of a man who carried kindness like a hidden weapon. By evening the saloon swelled with voices. Fear drove men to drink and to talk louder than they felt brave. Sheriff Dalton stood behind the bar with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his badge catching the lamplight but doing nothing to convince the crowd. "Now listen here," he barked, though his voice cracked under the strain. "I ain't about to send good men to their graves standing against Ramirez. Best we keep our heads low. They take what they want, then move on. That's the way of it." A rancher slammed his fist on the table, the sound rattling empty glasses. "You're sworn to protect us, Dalton. What good's a sheriff if he hides while bandits bleed us dry?" Dalton's face reddened, but his bluster faltered. You want to fight men who ride with death at their heels. Be my guest. I won't be leading you into it. Murmurs of frustration rippled, but no one stood. Fear strangled courage in their throats. At a shadowed table near the corner, Eli sat with his hat brim dipped low, listening. He nursed no drink, only silence. The smoke and noise drifted around him, but his gaze remained fixed, thoughtful, measuring. He saw men fold under their own fear, and he saw in Dalton the hollowness of authority without backbone. Eli said nothing, for words were wasted when men's hearts had already yielded. The night deepened, and with it came the sound the town dreaded, hoofbeats pounding against the earth, a rhythm like war drums. Dust rose in the moonlight as the Ramirez gang thundered down the main street. Gunfire split the silence, shots fired skyward in mockery, laughter that carried like howls. Doors slammed shut, shutters barred, but there was no hiding from men who came to take. They dismounted with swagger, rifles swinging, boots striking the earth like they owned it. They stormed the shops, overturning barrels, dragging frightened merchants into the street. One snatched a gold chain from a woman's neck, another slapped the sheriff's star off Dalton's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt while his revolver stayed holstered. Ramirez himself, a broadman with eyes like coals, spat at the sheriff's boots and laughed. This town's as soft as I remember. Easier each time we come. Among the townsfolk forced into the square was Sarah. A pair of outlaws spotted her lingering at the edge, clutching her bread as if it were shield enough. One pointed and sneered, recognition flaring cruelly. Well, if it ain't the drunkard's whelp. Maybe Ramirez ought to show her what real shame looks like. They closed in, their grins twisted with intent. Before Sarah could shrink back, a figure stepped between her and the wolves. Eli. His shadow stretched long in the lantern light, his stance unshaken though he stood alone. The outlaws laughed, expecting another fool ready to beg for scraps of mercy. But Eli's voice cut through the night, low and steady, carrying more weight than the sheriff's badge ever had. You've taken enough from this town. The gang fell into silence for a beat, then erupted in jeers. Ramirez himself stepped forward, amused. And who are you, old man? Another farmer ready to be trampled. Eli did not flinch. He stood as though rooted to the earth itself, his eyes locked on Ramirez with a calm that unsettled the men who lived by fear. There was no trembling in his voice, no quiver in his hand. The townsfolk, hidden in doorways and shadows, held their breath, sensing something shift. The laughter of the gang rang hollow now, edged with unease. For though Eli wore no star and carried no boast, something in the way he faced them, straight and unwavering, suggested a truth none of them yet understood. By the following morning, whispers wound their way through the town like smoke curling under doors. The man who had stepped between Sarah and the Ramirez gang was no ordinary rancher, they said. Old-timers swore they remembered the name Eli McGraw from the war, sharpshooter, faster than a snake strike, a man whose rifle had held whole ridges against impossible odds. Others muttered darker tales, that he had once been a gunslinger feared across the frontier, who vanished after burying his wife and child beneath stony soil somewhere west of the Rio Grande. No one knew the truth entire, but the fragments painted him in hues of both legend and sorrow. The townsfolk, who yesterday dismissed him as a weary drifter, now looked sidelong with a new kind of wariness, as if the dust itself might carry the echo of his past. Eli said nothing of it. He carried his silence like a cloak, walking the town with that same unhurried step, eyes ever measuring, mind set on what was to come. When dusk fell, he left the warmth of lamplight behind and moved to the edges of the land, where shadows grew thick around canyon trails. With the patience of a man who had lived long among solitude, he began to prepare. His knife glinted in the moonlight as he sharpened it against stone, the rhythmic rasp sounding like a heartbeat. He studied the canyon paths, his gaze tracing every bend and choke point, every place a man could lay in wait. In silence he laid snares, simple but sure, and scattered nails to cripple horses if the gang gave chase. Sarah followed him, her steps soft but uncertain, compelled by both fear and curiosity. She found him crouched by a ridge, laying a tripwire between two rocks. His movements were calm, precise, as though he had done such things 1,000 times before. You mean to face them alone, she whispered, voice trembling in the vast night. Eli turned, his face half-lit by moonlight, unreadable. Alone's the only way some fights are won, he said. But you'll be killed, she protested, clutching the loaf he had given her days before, though now hardened with time. Eli's eyes softened for a moment, the weariness in them carrying the weight of graves she could not see. "Death don't scare me," he murmured. "But letting them carve their cruelty into every soul here, that would be worse." His words silenced her protests. She stood watching as he worked, realizing that this man was not just quiet by nature but shaped by loss into something deeper, something unbreakable. The town slept fitfully, but the night carried no peace. Hoofbeats returned, low at first, then rolling louder until lanterns flickered in windows and fear rose from bedrolls like smoke. The Ramirez gang thundered back, their laughter slicing through the darkness, intent this time on leaving nothing standing. Torches flared in their fists, casting twisted shadows against walls they meant to burn. And in the middle of the street, Eli waited. Dust coiled around his boots, lantern light wavered across his weathered face. He stood alone, head brim low, as if the earth itself had placed him there to halt the tide. Sarah pressed herself against the boards of the building, watching with breath held tight in her chest, her heart drumming louder than the approaching hoofbeats. The gang reined in, sneers curling on their faces at the sight of a lone figure. Ramirez himself spat in the dirt. "One man to guard a whole town," he mocked, voice booming. "We'll grind you under, old man." Eli's voice came low but steady. "You've taken enough. Tonight it ends." The words struck like a bell in the silence, and then the street erupted in chaos. Guns flashed in the dark, thunder cracking between buildings. Eli's hand moved faster than sight, revolver leaping from his holster as if summoned by the air itself. A shot rang true, dropping the first outlaw before he could squeeze his trigger. Dust burst upward with each blast, lantern light strobing across faces twisted in rage. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, unable to look away. Eli did not shoot wild or wasteful. Every bullet carried purpose, every motion precise. He moved with terrifying calm, turning, firing, advancing step by step. One outlaw lunged from a rooftop, but Eli's shot caught him midair, his body crashing through a railing. Another rushed from behind with a knife, only to be struck by the butt of Eli's revolver, sent sprawling into the dust. He was not reckless. He was a storm contained, each strike measured, his composure more fearsome than the bullets themselves. The gang faltered, shock rippling through them. Ramirez snarled and fired wildly, but his bullets struck only shutters and dirt. Eli's gun answered with cold accuracy, grazing Ramirez's arm, spinning him backward with a cry of rage. The outlaws exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado slipping as the legend of the men before them revealed itself with every heartbeat. In the chaos, one outlaw stumbled, clutching a wound at his side. Blood trickled between his fingers, but it was not pain that froze him. It was recognition. His eyes widened as he stared at Eli, memories dredged from the smoke of other battlefields. "God help us," he rasped, his voice carrying in the lull of gunfire. "That ain't no rancher. That's Eli McGraw, the lone shot." The name spread through the gang like wildfire, each man reacting as though the ghost of death himself had risen in flesh. Eli McGraw, the sharpshooter whispered of in hushed saloon corners, the men who once turned whole skirmishes with a rifle from half a mile away. Some said he'd been hired gun, others a soldier without equal, but all knew one thing: to face him was to court death. Panic erupted. A few outlaws dropped their weapons outright, spurring their horses into retreat. Others fired wildly in desperation, their fear ruining their aim. Ramirez roared in fury, calling them cowards, but the tide had already shifted. What had begun as a raid turned into a scramble for survival, the gang's confidence shattered by the weight of a name carried like thunder. From the shadows, Sarah watched the transformation, her fear giving way to awe. The men who had offered her bread, who had spoken kindness at a dry creek bed, now stood revealed not as a weary drifter but as a legend of the frontier. Yet it was not his speed with the gun alone that struck her. It was the calm in his eyes, the steadiness of a man who did not seek glory, only justice. And as the gang scattered into the night, the town that once laughed at her shame realized they were witnessing not only a battle but the unveiling of a truth that would echo across the desert long after the gun smoke cleared.